Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the 2022 ACEEE Hot Water Forum. Thank you so much for attending our session, Gas Solutions. I'm Aaron Weiner with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and I'll be your moderator for today. We'll get things started in just a minute. A few housekeeping items that I'm going to run through. First and foremost, I really want to thank all of our sponsors as well as ACEEE ally members for your support of the Hot Water Forum and ACEEE. In terms of kind of operations on our screen here, which is going to be hopefully our last online format for this conference, use the chat box on the right to ask questions of the presenters. And what I'll be doing as you ask those questions is gathering those and share them with the presenters once all the presentations are complete. If we don't get to your question, a couple options. One is afterwards, we're going to have 20 minutes of chat and discussion via Zoom. And then also I'll be in that session. If we don't get to your question then, never fear, I know where to find our two speakers, and we'll make sure that I get your questions to them so that we can follow up. And just a kind of a friendly rules of the road reminder, please refrain from using the chat for any dialogue other than asking questions. We really want to focus on that, and I think there's going to be a lot of questions today. So be sure also to check out the tabs on the left-hand side of the app. From there, you can network with other attendees at the forum, look at the program, visit sponsor pages, and engage in a game to possibly win free registration to next year's in-person conference in Mission Hills, California. Sounds pretty great to me right now. So the resources section has a program with a list of attendees. You can take a look at that. And then lastly, as always, we want to ask people to help us planning future forums by completing a conference evaluation. And anybody that completes it and includes a testimonial gets a $25 credit for that registration next year. All of these presentations are going to be available on demand viewing for registered attendees on this platform within a few days, and they will be up until May. Presenter slides can be found on their page in the program participants section. So with all of that out of the way, I am going to introduce our speakers. So we've got Richard Donnelly, who is the Director of Energy Innovation for Vermont Gas Systems, or VGS, and Paul Glanville, who is the R&D Director at Gas Technology Institute's Building Energy Efficiency Group. This is going to be a really exciting session. I'm looking forward to hearing from both presenters as well as any questions. I think it's going to really trigger some great dialogue. We're going to start off with our first speaker, Richard Donnelly, and he is currently, as I said, the Director of Energy Innovation for Vermont Gas Systems, and he oversees the creation of really a new product portfolio focused on decarbonization and efficiency. He is leading the company's efforts in developing new business models for in-home services and utility-scale geothermal. So again, I know that the title of our session is Gas Solutions, and I really think it's innovative and exciting and maybe unexpected gas solutions. So I'm going to turn things over to Richard, who is going to talk about how and why a natural gas utility is installing electric heat pump water heaters.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me? I hope so. Earlier the mics were causing some problems here. Let me get my screen here ready to share. And I'll start just by introducing myself. Thank you, Aaron. All right, my name is Richard Donnelly. I'm the Director of Energy Innovation at VGS. And I've been there now for about 2 years. I came over from the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, where I worked mostly on the Efficiency Vermont contract, some of you may be familiar with. I worked there for about 11 years. So I've been to, I'm very excited to be here today, but I've been to lots of ACEEE events. But this is my first hot water forum. So I'm pretty excited. It's regrettable, but understandable that we couldn't be meeting in person. I can't see all your faces, but here we are, and I look forward to next year. Before I start, I want to thank Lynn Pyle and Aaron, for their support for my participation today. As Aaron said, I think you'll find it interesting. This is on one level about a heat pump water heater program, but on another level, it's really about a gas utility transforming. So I'm going to share with you what VGS, what the natural gas utility in Vermont is doing to transform from our legacy business model of a fossil fuel distribution utility into a decarbonized thermal solutions provider. Let me start a little bit by introducing who VGS is. So VGS, we call ourselves that now, is formerly Vermont Gas Systems. We're a small local distribution company serving 3 counties tucked up into the northwest corner of Vermont. We're a fully regulated gas utility. We're also a fully regulated, ratepayer-funded energy efficiency utility, one of the 3 in the state, the other 2 being Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric. We have 55,000 customers. We have about 130 some odd employees, of which about 40% are customer facing. And I call this out because you'll see later in my presentation how important these customer facing staff are in not only creating customer value, but really maintaining and preserving that trust we've earned with our customers over the many decades that we've been in existence. And that trust extends even with folks who see our core product as harmful to the environment. Just in terms of impact in Vermont, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector, VGS represents a portion of that, right? About 8 to 9% of that comes from our service to residential customers, and about 14% comes from our service to commercial customers. So way back in 1966, natural gas pipelines were innovation in Vermont. Everything was oil, propane, kerosene, coal, and you probably won't be surprised about this, but wood. A lot of diverse fuels. VGS was the first, pipeline and the only pipeline distribution system in the state. As I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, it's interesting to note that VGS has provided direct energy efficiency services now going on 30 years. And in 2016, VGS became an official efficiency utility. That's a ratepayer-funded energy efficiency utility, separately regulated from our local distribution company that delivers gas. Separate budgets, separate funding streams, really separate operations altogether. Although we're under one roof and we act as an integrated energy services provider, just the budgets are different from that perspective. Our growth has averaged about 1,000 customers per year. And in most communities, we have a very, very high penetration rate. However, we know that type of growth will no longer be sustainable, at least not simply by being the gas company. A lot has changed in the past decade. In Vermont and many other places, the environmental, the political, the economic, and the social impacts of climate change are really incompatible with extending our pipeline to new communities. So in 2019, VGS asked itself, what is the future of natural gas in Vermont? And from that exercise came our climate plan and recognition that our growth and success really rested on our ability to innovate and transform our business model. And in late 2019, we announced a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for our customers by 30% by 2030, and then to be net zero by 2050. And since at that time, since 2 years ago, we've increased that 2030 goal to be 40% to align our model, our business model, our climate plan with those goals that were established under the Global Warming Solutions Act. You can see we've already gotten busy. We've launched a renewable natural gas on a local family-owned dairy farm. We've greatly expanded our weatherization rebates and increased our efficiency budget by almost 60%. We've launched a heat pump water heater program, which you'll hear about in a minute. And we have just announced a green hydrogen project, which I'll make mention of in just a second. So, right, we're transforming our business model literally in step with how Vermont energy policy is transforming as well. At the very high level, our transformation requires lots of collaboration with stakeholders, other energy providers, other organizations and policymakers. And we're really trying to meet or exceed those greenhouse gas reduction targets set forth in the Global Warming Solutions Act. The state of Vermont has adopted those and is held accountable to achieving those goals and can actually be sued by citizens if we don't. On the ground level, though, it's really about leveraging our 56 or some odd years experience supporting Vermonters who want to transition to clean energy sources. So our ground level initiatives reflect the emerging state energy policy. And of course, we all know it starts with efficiency first. This is the cornerstone of our climate plan. We're going to build upon our 30 years of experience with energy efficiency. We're going to double down on weatherization, and we're going to shift the program resources towards reducing energy burden, really targeted towards income-sensitive households and supporting our commercial customers. We're also developing alternative low or no carbon renewable supply sources to displace fossil fuel gas. As I mentioned, we have a farm project which we launched last fall that is providing renewable natural gas from a farm and some food waste. So we're going to be increasing the amounts of our renewable natural gas in our system to 20% of the total load by 2030. We also have a green hydrogen project in partnership with University of Vermont and Global Foundries, a local semiconductor manufacturer. We are also involved in district heating projects, and we're developing what we may get into later is a utility geothermal business model. And last but not least, and really the focus of today and where hot water fits in, we're going to be creating new business models for in-home services, in-home decarbonized services, such as our heat pump water heater offering and things like hybrid heating and the aforementioned geothermal. So those three strategies that I just mentioned, energy efficiency, in-home services, alternative supply, those are all sort of external facing products and services. But we have to think about how our gas utility, how our business goes from being seen as a problem to solve to one that is seen as a resource for accelerating the state's climate goals. So what about the changes to the organization itself? How do we transform culturally and functionally as a business? And how can we demonstrate that we've earned a seat at the table? So this transformation actually began not coincidentally with this sort of smooth transition in leadership back in 2019. And that new leader, the new president and CEO, really began to figure out how we needed to organize ourselves in order to set ourselves up for success in this effort to decarbonize. So there was an organizational restructure. There are now two vice presidents that both have innovation in their titles. One is focusing on the supply, and then one is focusing on the in-home services and how we engage with our customers. VGS began investing in people, bringing on new staff, creating new departments, really focused on building the portfolio of new decarbonized services and products. We've done extensive modeling for our climate plan. How will this financially transition from what we can expect as declining revenue, declining profits in the gas section of our business, and how can we replace that with emerging business models? So we've had to model a number of scenarios around how this transition will work. We've done extensive stakeholder and policy engagement really to discuss what our plans are and how to best proceed and how to collaborate. You can imagine the regulatory and the legislative strategy too, as well, as Vermont puts new policies in place that really begin to shape exactly how this transition towards 2030 and ultimately 2050 takes place. We've had to really invest in resources on those fronts. Now, on the ground level, we have pilots and field partnerships with other HVAC contractors. We're piloting not only heat pump water heaters, but we have a number of hybrid heating type of pilots. We're doing some R&D on calculators that balance cost versus carbon. A number of fronts we're investing in on the ground level just to understand how to best position our business for our customers. And of course, there's so much education and promotion that needs to happen with our customers so they understand why we're doing this, what we're doing, how we're doing it, asking them for guidance, asking them for participation. But it is quite an effort on just the engagement front with customers to let them know why VGS is moving in this direction. Why is the gas company offering an electric heat pump water heater? So yes, we are in hot water. And that's a clever little title, but for decades, we've been installing and leasing water heaters, gas water heaters, with our customers. And it's been a very quiet little part of our business, not a big revenue generator, but we've got numerous, we have several thousand of hot water leases out there. A lot of landlords take part in this. And then there's a lot of new homeowners that take part in this too, because it's an easy way to get into a new hot water heater or an efficient hot water heater. But since we've been doing this the whole time, it makes sense that we would then think about, well, what if we came up with a business model that allowed us to install a different type of hot water heater? So as part of our decarbonization planning, we did extensive modeling. Vermont did this too, really to conduct and break down exactly where the greenhouse gas reductions have to come from. So in the thermal sector, it will be no surprise that heat pump water heaters and cold climate heat pumps are going to be shouldering so much of that burden of taking fossil fuels, displacing fossil fuels. You can see this chart on the right. These are some of the goals that Vermont has determined that we have to meet across the state to essentially hit our targets. There's a huge jump in market adoption there. And so, this is another good reason for VGS to think about what is our role. And so if we repurpose our service team, our field service team, to put in electric solutions versus gas solutions, that actually helps make the pie bigger towards these goals. So that's another strategy that we have, is how can we take the resources we have internally now and apply them towards these new goals and begin to experiment what that business model looks like. Ultimately, can we actually mitigate rate pressure from lost revenue with these new in-home services? So a little bit about our actual heat pump water heater pilot. We've chosen this Tier 4 REAM model, this Professional Prestige ProTerra hybrid water heater, for lots of reasons. One, it has the highest performing efficiency rating. It also is ready for demand response programs, which many of our utilities are now getting into. This model was far and above many of the other models in the market at the moment, and we decided to go forward with it as in our pilot. A lot of what we'll be learning in our pilot will be, how do customers like the water heater? Does it actually perform at the rating that it says it's going to perform? We're going to be providing this not only to our own customers, but we've also gotten permission to go outside of our service territory. And that's key because in Vermont anyway, and I know many parts of the country, natural gas prices are low and our electricity prices are quite high. Most of our residential utility rates are above 18 cents a kilowatt hour. So that you can imagine that given the affordability of natural gas, that a lot of natural gas customers are wondering, well, will this heat pump water heater save money? And not in all cases, it depends on what the baseline is. But with propane and oil customers, those who are just off of our distribution system, it certainly is a win. Even before the latest global crisis took root, gas prices and oil prices and propane prices made these models very, very attractive for ongoing costs. We are leveraging these Tier 3 rebate, what we call Tier 3 rebates in the state of Vermont. Tier 3 refers to a program that the electric utilities are responsible for, which is essentially to provide incentives to displace fossil fuel. So they have these rebates that exist today, and we're leveraging those rebates. They run the gamut from $600 for a water heater up to $1,400 for a water heater. And then there's a low and moderate income bonus for that for $200, really driving down that price. We're baking those rebates into the lease that we offer, and also into the sale price. So they get it right off the top, makes it easy for the customer to adopt this technology. So right around the corner, right around the corner from our heat pump water heater program, we have a number of other things that we are now getting into a pilot stage. One is hybrid heating, including thermally driven heat pumps. We're looking at cold climate heat pumps in Vermont, which are being driven, again, by incentives, and tying those into a central furnace to create a centralized heating and cooling system that can be balanced by either temperature set points based on cost goals or carbon goals. We're trying to help our customers understand the carbon impacts of this type of approach. Hybrid heating is really attractive to a lot of folks in Vermont. We have a lot of old home stock here, so it's not easy just to put in cold climate heat pumps and expect that they'll perform satisfactorily. Sometimes you need to have not only weatherization, but you also need to have that backup or the auxiliary heat source, from fossil fuel. So we think that the hybrid heating approach is going to be a really good fit. But again, there's not enough contractors educating and promoting the consumers on this. And while the incentives exist, VGS can play a role in promoting, educating, and then installing. Utility geothermal is another hot topic. It actually overlays near perfectly with the VGS business model. If you think about what a gas utility does, it puts pipe in the ground, and it's actually the same pipe. The geothermal pipe is the same pipe that is used for gas distribution. And so we put pipe in the ground. We make long-term investments in that energy infrastructure. We provide the maintenance on that energy infrastructure, and we can even incorporate in that business model the equipment that goes inside the house, the ground source heat pumps. And you can wrap that all in to what would be either a lease for the equipment and the distribution on the loops, or just the loops. And so it really aligns perfectly with our billing model, with our regulation model, and also the core skills of our company. As I mentioned before, we're going to be expanding our energy efficiency program and leveraging many of the federal dollars that are coming into Vermont and other parts of the Northeast. We're expanding our commercial water heating with obviously the thermally driven heat pumps, but also new on-demand technology that's out there. And then the last but not least, I'll mention that there's this thing called the Clean Heat Standard, which is being going through the legislative process right now. And this is very similar to what many states have as a renewable portfolio standard. It really puts the fossil fuel distribution entities, organizations, on the hook for decarbonizing. And the metric there is greenhouse gas emission reductions. So the legislation going through is really going to require both Vermont Gas, if it passes, Vermont Gas plus some of the larger distribution oil and propane dealers and distributors to begin to acquire the credits that are earned through the displacement of fossil fuel end uses, but also it can provide credit for what we generate for renewable natural gas and other biofuels. So this is going to be a game changer. It's going to put some guardrails around the gas utilities business in a way that protects affordability and protects particularly those who are most energy burdened, but also provide us with a more even path towards our transition from that legacy fossil fuel company to one that is now committed to decarbonization on a fast track. And with that, that's it. That's it for me. I'm excited about any questions we might get, and I realize that the questions are being moderated, so I'll pause there and hand it back over to Aaron.
Really exciting to see the innovation and really expansion of business that y'all are doing. I know I wrote down a bunch of questions, but I'll wait until the Zoom chat to ask them. But there is one that I do see pending. And Bob is asking if there are any residential gas electric hybrids that are currently on the market, or are you using two separate pieces of equipment?
Strategy, I assume he means, right? So those, we will be getting into those combination units that I now see emerging on the market. Right now, we're looking at folks who have existing high efficiency systems. They have a weatherized home, and what they're looking for is some resilience, some cooling, but also some carbon reduction. So that's how we're sort of doing our customer generation, our customer qualification, is focusing on folks who have existing systems. Down the road, and that's the beginning of it. So that'll be our pilot approach for about a year. And then we're going to begin to think about how we evolve that to get into hydronic systems, and also to look at combined units for hybrid.
Great, thank you. I'll pause for a minute and see if anybody else has any kind of near-term clarifying questions, or if y'all would like to continue to think about your questions, and we can pose them during the Zoom session, which will immediately follow. Great, I got another one from Eric. The question is the geothermal or GeoExchange program, is that meant to provide hot water for both heating and traditional, or I'm guessing DHW uses?
So the each of the when I talk about utility geo, first of all, just to clarify that, we're talking about where the way we would get into that market is to look at new construction market on the residential side. We're looking at how this looks like a utility and how this feels like a utility, because we don't want to compete head to head with just geothermal designers and geothermal practitioners. So we'd be looking at connecting multiple loads, like in a new residential development. The solutions that are on the behind the meter would run from the heating and cooling to the water heating. It really depends on what the developer owner wants to consider for that. The alternative for the hot water would be a heat pump water heater for the new construction. So either way that plays, it probably would boil down to the most cost-effective approach for the hot water solution as it relates to the geothermal system.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Richard. We're going to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Paul Glanville. So Paul is the R&D director at GTI's Building Energy Efficiency Group, working to deliver solutions for a safe, efficient, and environmentally responsible built environment. GTI works with industry and academia while leading to several products, patents, and publications. So Paul is going to talk today about innovative water heating technology pairings. I kind of like to think about this as those pictures that you always see of unlikely partners with animals, like where the cheetah is friends with a tortoise or something. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm going to just go out on a limb here and say that I'm the tortoise in that pairing. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Let me just make sure I get my screen set up here. View, slideshow, use presenter view. Let's see if that works. Forgive me while I deal with my multiple screens. Try and fix that here. All right. There we go. So here, the goal for this next presentation, which dovetails very nicely with Richard's great presentation on the wide array of solutions and pathways that our multiple delivered fuel utilities are taking to move towards decarbonization. Here we're going to get a bit into the weeds. We're going to talk about a specific problem or challenge, which is how do we largely address the thermal loads of existing multifamily and commercial buildings. We're going to focus on hot water, but of course, we're going to talk also about space heating, sort of in the same way as Richard had noted, for some hybrid type solutions. So playing nicely together, we want the cheetah and the tortoise to get along nicely. Nobody eats each other, but we play to their strengths. And actually, I think that's a perfect, I don't know if you meant to do this, Aaron, but that's a great analogy, because if you think of existing fuel-fired equipment, those are cheetahs. They come on really fast and they have a lot of capacity. But heat pumps, in a way, are more like tortoises, where they will win the race eventually, but they require some time to ramp up, and we need to rethink our approach to I guess, continuing with the animal metaphor, rethinking our approach to the animal kingdom when we talk about heat pumps here. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll do an introduction and motivation to pairing heat pump technologies with conventional, again, mostly focusing on hydronic applications here for multifamily and commercial buildings. I'll talk about hydronic heat pumps, the hydronic heating approach, or hybrid heating approach rather. How do we pair those two types of systems together to make the most of cost-effective greenhouse gas emission reductions? We're going to skew a little bit towards thermally driven heat pumps here, because that's where a lot of our research and demonstrations can provide some examples. But a lot of what I'll talk about will apply broadly across other kinds of hydronic heat pumps, and we'll touch on that as well. We'll focus on some new results, and then we'll talk about conclusions and next steps. And you'll see a number of photos of installations here. For instance, here is one hydronic heat pump operating at a multifamily building in the Chicago area, not too far from where I'm talking to you right now. So we don't want to assume, but perhaps we can with this audience, that we all understand what a heat pump is. It's moving heat uphill, so to speak, from a cold source to a warm sink. Most of what we're talking about are air source heat pumps, although certainly with a lower cost and subsidized geothermal or geo-exchange heat exchangers, we may talk a lot more about water source heat pumps as well. And these heat pumps can be driven by electric drive energy or thermal drive energy. We'll touch on both aspects here. Now, in terms of hybrid heating, drawing your attention to the cartoon in the lower right here, this is really sort of a term of art where we have a heating distribution system in a building that may be providing surface hot water or hydronic heating or both, and multiple different types of technologies are connected into that distribution network and working together or separately, depending on how the controls are designed. Boilers, traditional water heaters, heat recovery, this can come from other forms of equipment. So if you're thinking of CHP, that would fall into this category. And then, of course, hydronic heat pumps, which have the added benefit of also providing chilled water or air conditioning if the application needs it. Of course, with a system like this, we may also employ buffer or thermal energy storage, which can help us take advantage of low carbon or zero carbon energy when it's available. We'll also talk in this discussion about thermally driven heat pumps. And again, don't want to make any assumptions here. Want to make sure we get these definitions up front. These are heat pump processes that, just like those described previously, that use a source of heat. And this can be from combusting a fuel. It can be from waste heat recovery. It can even be from renewable heat collection, for example. For those that are driven by fuels, thermally driven heat pumps may also be referred to as gas-fired heat pumps or fuel-fired heat pumps. Again, those terms are not mutually exclusive, but we will use them somewhat interchangeably in this presentation here. And one thing I should also mention, thermally driven heat pumps, because they largely use they use refrigerants that require unitary sealed system designs, in most cases refrigerants that must be contained within the device. These are typically water delivery type systems. Therefore, they tend to resemble boilers, and that's one thing that we'll touch on in this presentation quite a bit. Now, quickly, in terms of motivation, I think one thing we all understand, but maybe we don't say enough, is that in the discussion around decarbonization, energy efficiency and conservation really still comes first. This is the base of our pyramid, and it is the most important thing. It really is incumbent on us to apply the most efficient technologies and approaches before or as we're beginning to employ delivered renewable energy sources, thermal energy storage, and things of that nature. And in commercial hot water, this is still an important area for us. because the largest, at least where delivered fuels are used, natural gas is used, the largest gas load in multifamily buildings and the second largest gas load in restaurants, the first, of course, being cooking, is hot water, service hot water in these applications. And we'll touch on a recently completed study in California where the restaurant sector, now mind you, these are pre-COVID figures, but 340 million therms per year were consumed by restaurants in this category. Now, typically, where fuels are used for commercial hot water, it's either a boiler paired with an IST, an indirect storage tank. This can be either dedicated or on a zone, or it could be storage type. And rack tankless products or other forms of instantaneous type water heating are emerging, and there's definitely an increasing place for those. Now, this is an industry, perhaps in comparison to residential buildings, where efficiency is readily valued. Over the past decade, the high efficiency fuel-fired products, gas-fired products, have doubled in growth, and now they're over 50% of that particular market. And that continues to increase with all the pressures we're talking about here. Now, the interest here is to go beyond condensing if we're going to want to further decarbonize our process. Heat pumps will need to play a role. It's really hard to bump up against that thermal efficiency limitation for a combustion-driven process. We have to go to some kind of a heat pump product. We're also going to talk mostly about retrofit-ready approaches where we can raise the net efficiency of an existing heating distribution system greater than 100%, increasing that system COP, if you will, above its traditional lower level. And where available, where useful, free cooling per se is a great approach. Now, just a little bit of a zoom in on multifamily buildings as well. This audience knows this very well. One thing just first we'd like to point out is that when in the discussions around having our institutions, our regions, and even our whole nations get to a net zero economy by 2050, most of the buildings that we will be dealing with at that time frame exist today. I think we understand that buildings have a long life, and decisions that have been made and will continue to be made will have bearing on how challenging it is to get to net zero. So when talking about multifamily buildings, it's very important to acknowledge that about half of their greenhouse gas emissions come from space and water heating, largely from these disproportionately used delivered fuels for these loads. These tenants, as compared to single-family residential, they're more likely to experience energy insecurity, and actually that also is a pre-COVID data point, so we anticipate that that's going to continue. And there's also a diversity, and when we talk about large multifamily buildings, 4 units or greater, as a rough rule of thumb, that these buildings are less likely to have forced air heating distribution, meaning they're more likely to use hydronic type heat distribution, particularly in colder climates and or cities that have a older housing stock, such as Chicago. And they're more likely to use, as a result, steam or hot water boilers that are fueled with natural gas in cold climates. So we're sort of focusing in on this subsector here. Now the question, the $10 million question, or maybe that number should be greater. How do we decarbonize these roughly 4 million multifamily housing units with central boilers and roughly 1 million restaurants out there today that are largely using delivered natural gas for their hot water and heating loads? And an example here from our test site here as to what the boilers and hot water heaters typically look like in these installations. Very, very typical here. We really have a few options here. Certainly we can electrify these particular buildings here with cold climate air source heat pumps for heating, central type heat pumps for water heating, or perhaps as a combined design. Where this is cost effective, both from a capital and operating expense, there are other barriers that exist that we take into account in terms of the existing buildings utility distribution and the costs to upgrade if that's necessary. Richard touched on the loss of resiliency, and this is something we also want to take into account. Could we convert our boiler or water heater to operate on delivered hydrogen? Sort of a more common question nowadays, but the technology is unproven. It's not available in the US. And it's really, there's a lot of uncertainty around the distribution of this fuel, either blended or up to pure. So the timing is a little bit unclear there. So if you're making this kind of decision now, we advocate for, one approach we advocate for is a hybrid heating approach, where we can integrate conventional high efficiency equipment with heat pumps. We can phase in designs, we can maximize the lifetimes of existing investments while also making a dent in your carbon footprint and also doing so cost effectively while keeping options open when it comes to the potential to accept renewable electricity and fuels over the lifetime of this investment. So we will spend a lot of time looking at piping diagrams here, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this example here, but just to give you an idea of what this could look like, here's one example of an approach where two boilers are tied to indirect tanks, and there's a hydronic loop. The tanks are, of course, providing hot water, sanitary hot water or domestic hot water to this multifamily building, while the boilers are also supporting the main hydronic loop here, where there are multiple zones that are served. Existing boilers and water heaters, in addition to using an inexpensive fuel, are good at what they do when it comes to capacity, and in most cases, part load performance. But of course, we have that efficiency limitation that was mentioned before. Hydronic heat pumps, they have great efficiency, a step change reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But increasingly, our capacity, our efficiency is now a function of environmental conditions. That's something we all appreciate. The efficiency declines with lower outdoor air temperature, higher return or supply water temperatures, and in general, we're talking about a 2 to 3x cost increase relative to conventional equipment. The effort or the proposal here is to go from a system efficiency of 80 to 95% as installed, augment it with air-to-water heat pumps, and bring that efficiency up by 120% or greater, while retaining some of the desirable features of the existing equipment as a source of backup heat, peak demand, meeting peak demands, and other aspects as well. One goal we have is for the heat pumps to serve most of the load most of the time, where the boilers or conventional water heaters can step in when things really get hairy. And just using thermally driven heat pumps as an example, we'll touch on this later on. It's very important how we size the heat pumps relative to the load to make sure that we're not paying for efficiency that we won't get, while also making sure that we do make an appreciable dent in both our carbon budget and also our utility budget as well. So there are other forms of hybrid heating out there, and I just want to provide one very brief example where even there is a case to be made that different types of boilers can be paired together to meet loads more efficiently. Hybrid boiler arrays are one example here. If you look at the diagrams on the right-hand side, where a traditional conventional approach with a 3-boiler array, each operating on its own on a primary loop, where the secondary loop is not shown but is downstream of there. That a hybrid boiler array could offer a different approach where the boilers are operating on a single zone. You see in the lower right-hand side here, they can operate in parallel rather than in series. And this allows for us to change our traditional approach to redundancy, or N+1, which is the common approach, while also trying to balance the efficiency with a peakier load, either a seasonal heating load or even a shifting hot water load. As proposed here, the 3 boilers would replace an N+1 array, where we would have one high efficiency boiler and multiple standard efficiency boilers. And if we size them correctly and control them correctly, even incorporating traditional approaches to outdoor temperature reset curves, we have a study recently published where 16 to 28% savings are shown just by replacing one of the boilers with a high efficiency boiler and using this approach. And it's important too to note that in terms of sizing, the boilers are sized to meet 50% of the load. So we have sort of 100 N plus 0.5, if you want to think of it that way. We retain the requirement around redundancy and also allow for in-field servicing and other features. Graphically, it would look a little bit like this here. On the left-hand side, you can see where the outdoor temperatures are warmer. The highest efficiency component will cover all of that load. As those temperatures decline, going towards the right of this chart, you will see that either a combination of a higher and lower efficiency component or all the lower efficiency components will cover those larger or possibly peak demands. Our preference would be the former, but this is really dictated by end user economics. On the right-hand side, a chart just shows you why this approach is done. outdoor temperature reset curves for air source equipment and equipment serving space heating loads. Typically, your supply water temperatures and thus your return water temperatures increase as the temperature declines. And we want to make sure that we aren't paying for efficiency that we aren't getting if those warmer temperatures cause higher efficiency equipment to operate less efficiently. And there is a balance that can be deployed there, which has been looked at for this type of arrangement. Okay, so let's get back to heat pumps. Why heat pumps? I think we appreciate that it's a very efficient approach to providing hot water and or space heating for where otherwise a traditional combustion process is used. And almost all of delivered fuels in residential buildings and a large fraction in commercial buildings is used to either heat air or water, including the generation of steam. This is a very thermodynamically inefficient thing to do. We're taking a 2000 degrees Celsius flame and we're raising air to above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so. We're raising water to be above body temperature. There are other ways for us to take advantage of that high grade energy. And you can see kind of two examples of where we have this mismatch. In the leftmost simplified diagram here, standard heating, we waste a lot of high grade energy to heat hot water when we have a fuel source here. And the same could be said for other high grade energy sources. For traditional thermal power generation, we do the opposite. We capture that high grade energy in the form of mechanical work, which can drive a generator, and we waste the heat because we're not able to couple the thermal load with the on-site generation. Heat pumps, combined heat and power, other forms of integrated or hybrid system, you have this very perfectly aligned energy cascade where useful work can drive a heat pump process and you can incorporate heat recovery in order to make the most of that high value energy you're bringing to your site. So we won't go too quick, won't spend too much time on the sort of taxonomy of thermally driven heat pumps here, but I will say at this point in the presentation, I will start skewing towards these types of heat pumps, even though as compared to boilers and traditional water heaters, these there are a lot of features and guidance here that will apply to other kinds of hydronic heat pumps, namely those that are electrically driven or use vapor compression cycles. The studies I'll mention focus on thermally driven heat pumps, but hopefully folks looking at those technologies can find some use out of what I'm presenting here. And I'll go quickly through this animation here just to show you that in terms of thermally driven heat pumps, there are multiple different types of flavors out there. They use different refrigerants, they scale up and down in different ways, they employ different thermodynamic cycles. But you can see that in terms of the cycles are sufficiently different from one another that companies, startups, major manufacturers really do not provide across these different categories. They focus on one. Most of what we'll talk about today are in the middle category using sorption type thermally driven heat pumps, and you can see some of the market players there that we've talked about in previous hot water forums and in other presentations. Also, won't want to go too much into the details shown here, but the thermally driven heat pumps that I'll talk about from our demonstration results, they all tend to focus on the ammonia water absorption cycle that is a fuel-driven process. And in these demos, the thermally driven heat pump component, which if you're able to see my pointer, is the series of boxes on the right-hand side of this box diagram over here. They represent the thermal compressor, if you will, if you're familiar with this process. And just like any other compressor, they accept a low temperature, low pressure vapor refrigerant, and they yield a high pressure, high temperature vapor refrigerant. They do so by combining the refrigerant with a liquid. They raise the pressure of that combined solution, and then they boil off the refrigerant with a source of heat, and they purify that refrigerant before it's sent to the condenser. The left-hand chart here shows from some prior GTI testing that for this particular single effect device, which has a projected 140% AFUE rating, that the COP on a gas input basis is both a function of ambient air temperature and of the return water temperature here. This is here for folks' reference, if you like. Now, there are products available today that use this kind of cycle or similar cycles to this, certainly that use the ammonia water absorption technology overall. And there have been a number of pilots completed recently, both in Canada and also in the US, looking at either hot water exclusively or hot water plus space heating or hot water plus cooling type applications. And there's a lot that we can draw from these in terms of both verifying their delivered efficiency, where seasonal values are seen between about 1.1 and 1.65 in terms of a seasonal COP, when in some cases either just focusing on hot water or also including other outputs as well. Larger buildings have been employed, large senior homes, heavy use in restaurants, and then a wider range of sites that have been completed. And I encourage you, not wanting to steal their thunder, but tomorrow there will be an update on the British Columbia pilot in session 3B, I believe it is. Now let's talk, so from these studies and from others that I'll highlight later on here, we can start to draw some conclusions about how to best deploy these products and these technologies in the field in a way to sort of make sure that the cheetah doesn't eat the tortoise. So I'll keep with that metaphor here. And a few things to think about that may not be sort of conventional wisdom if you're more used to boilers and traditional water heaters, is to plan for parallel operation. With these applications, especially if they're thermally intensive, we should take advantage of the fact that these thermally driven heat pumps can operate as a heat pump at temperatures down to negative 30 degrees C. And once you get down to that low and a little bit lower, it doesn't matter if we're talking Fahrenheit or C, it's pretty darn cold. With maximizing that runtime, we do not use more traditional approaches where there's a point where there's a baton handoff between the heat pump and the traditional fuel-fired technology. We want to make sure that we have flexibility in the heat pump's ability to operate and the boiler or water heater's ability to operate. Also, we want to put a lot of thought into how big we size the heat pumps. If they're 2 to 3 times or even more expensive than their replacement, we want to make sure we don't pay for more than we need, but we also play to the strengths of the cheetah and tortoise, if you will. The right-hand side chart here comes from a 2-site restaurant study that GTI performed for the California Energy Commission. And we found that the sizing sweet spot was between about 30 to 60% of the peak demand. Now, granted, we can measure the peak demand from this site, but we anticipate that standard sizing approaches would also fall within this band. And the reason why, and I'll highlight this on the next slide here, is that we want to make sure that our heat pump is able to operate for long duration cycles, and also that it only load follows when it needs to, meaning that if the heat pump is trying to react to the load and the changing in the loop temperatures, it will not reach its peak efficiency. We had 2 different sites with 2 different load amounts, but the heat pumps were the same size. It gave us a nice control to zero in on this range. Return water temperature is very important, certainly more important than it is for boilers and traditional water heaters. And we may have to employ designs that take this into account, where we want to make sure that our return water temperature remains below 60 degrees C, for example, or even in some cases, depending on manufacturer guidance, even lower than that. And finally, buffer tanks. We'll illustrate this by looking at a few diagrams here, that it may be useful to sort of thermally isolate your heat pump from the other portions of the distribution system in order to assure that we have those longer duration cycles and that we're able to make sure that we're able to sort of base load, if you will, relative to the rest of the building. And buffer tanks, 3000 is shown here, which is more for sort of smaller scale applications. They're not that expensive compared to other elements of what you're installing, so really worth taking a look. So if we have a site where we've put some thought into the controls, the sizing of the heat pump, we're managing the return water temperature, and we're using buffer tanks, let's take a look at sort of what this might look like if we do all these things correctly. And I mentioned the restaurant demonstration here, and what we're going to show kind of a snapshot from one site and the other, and we're going to highlight a few aspects here. The first site was a 24-hour diner, and there's a lot of traces on here. I'll draw your attention to those that are most relevant in this case here. This 24-hour diner had a moderate load of hot water, about 4,000 gallons a day, but it was spread out over the full day, as you would expect. So the heat pump that was operating in conjunction with traditional water heaters was load following. You can see this by looking at the trace in yellow, which shows you the input to the device, where it's meeting more than 2/3 of the service hot water load for the entire site here. As a result, the efficiency is low. The purple trace, we're at or slightly above 100% efficiency. We would want to be much above that, and it's variable. By contrast, a larger site, I used to say a site with a larger load, the heat pump is able to base load. We're only meeting 40 to 50% of the total demand, but you can see by that yellow trace that we are base loaded. It is at full output for this particular day. As a result, the COP on a gas basis is much higher. The scales are the same between the two charts. And we're within what we would expect from lab performance, about a 1.3 to 1.4. The reason it is varying is, of course, that the hot water demand is not steady in this particular case here, but that's okay because this device is able to sort of weather with that change. So let's look at a couple of diagrams here, and I want to make sure I don't go too far over. There are different ways to pair these systems together. This shows you how one manufacturer suggests to take the thermally driven heat pump, tie it with a buffer tank in its own loop, and then it communicates to the indoor distribution by way of a plate heat exchanger. The cold water is preheated by this plate heat exchanger, and that enters the shell side of an indirect water tank that's either part of the water heater or it's heated by the boiler. Here you can see that these systems are able to work together, and the buffer tank on the heat pump loop is able to make sure that we're able to operate in more of a steady load. In terms of the restaurants here, this is something we've shared with previous presentations. So in the interest of time, I'll go quickly through here. But in the same case here, we have the heat pump tied to its own tank, and that tank is preheating a conventional water heater that either is providing sort of peak heating or none at all. It's just a secondary form of storage. In this particular case here, for these two sites, we were able to also operate a chilled water loop to displace some of the air conditioning, and full reporting of this particular demonstration will be available soon. I'll provide some links towards the end. Finally, and I'll cover some quick results here on the multifamily application, where a central boiler and a gas water heater were replaced. Separate entities here. We went from the previous image to what's shown in this picture here. Thermally driven heat pump, in order to minimize the volume of the water glycol loop, because of course we're outdoors in a freezing climate, that plate heat exchanger isolates that loop, and then that communicates with the shell side of a buffer tank where cold water can be preheated before it goes into the indirect water heater. And that can be also supported by boilers that are connected directly to the main return and main supply on the hydronic loop, and also the water tank as well. In short, the heat pump can provide both space heating and water heating loads, and the boilers can do the same, and they can do both together. That, of course, the previous image showed you what it looked like because of our study, where there are certain aspects that are a temporary installation. A more permanent installation might look like this, slightly cleaner. So we're going to skip through some of the results here because I can see that I'm running a bit out of time. So I'm going to go all the way to the end just to give you some of the high points here. And apologies for having to rush here through this portion. One thing that we found through the early portions of the demonstration, as we were able to baseline the site rather, is that the heat pump would operate for too long. Actually, we were so successful with the controls that the heat pump operated in one case for nearly 2 weeks at a time. And while that sounds good in terms of achieving that steady state efficiency, we actually want to put a cap on that to not excessively put wear and tear on that particular heat pump on a load sharing way. I'll go quickly towards the end of this particular presentation here, keeping my eye on the clock, that the extrapolated annual savings with a paper shown in the bottom there for folks that are interested in the details, 41% savings over the existing boiler water heater setup, and even 24% just by improving the distribution with the boilers operating themselves, which corresponds to, in the heat pump case, 130% seasonal efficiency, which translates to an attractive payback. And we want to make sure that we are able to take advantage of the further improvements with this site, as it is an ongoing field test. I'll leave you with some demo next steps here, and I'm right at time, so thank you for sticking with me here. We'll continue to monitor this particular site. We'll be able to dedicate some more time to provide an update, perhaps at a following hot water forum. We're expanding this application to other use cases, including schools. We're looking to develop simplified models. So we have developed some simplified models to look at this hybrid heating approach, and we're coordinating with industry to identify key gaps. Now I'm going to leave you with some quick final thoughts as I'm going a little bit over here. So thank you, everyone. First is that hybrid heating systems, they integrate heat pumps and conventional boilers and hot water systems. This is really a critical strategy to decarbonize thermally intensive buildings, particularly old existing buildings. We can phase in retrofits. We can prioritize delivering renewable energy. something very important to keep in mind. If you leave with anything from this presentation, it's more important for the entire heating distribution and system to have a seasonal COP greater than 1 than it is for any individual component. In other words, the conventional, the peak, the auxiliary portions, those should be as efficient as they can, but there may be applications where we can't do everything with a heat pump. And that's why, in some cases, we may see more pre-assembled hybrid heating systems, such as shown in the picture there. Finally, hopefully I've convinced you that this approach requires a rethinking to how we design these hydronic systems, these controls, and other aspects as well. Thank you for your attention. Oh, and some links here. Sorry, one last thing. Some links here for the enthusiast. These are here for you to find in the PDF. And I want to acknowledge the many partners that got us to to have these results. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Richard, for some great presentations today. We are going to transition over to Zoom. I did record, there were a couple questions that came in, and I recorded those so I can pose those in Zoom, or the questioners can ask them directly. So I believe there should be a link at the very bottom of this page on the platform and on the Zoom link on your left. So please join us there. And thank you again to our speakers as well as our attendees.